Welcome to S&B Podcast. I'm John Sinclair, your host. I'm a corporate strategy specialist with special focus around growth and turnaround. I have designed and implemented some of the most complex transformation programs globally for Fortune 500 companies, as well as late-stage startups. And we hope to share some of those experiences with you, and I hope you will find them useful. So as you know, the last few episodes has been focused around leadership. So this is part of the Leadership Series podcast. And our typical guest that part of the leadership program or leadership series podcast that we bring forth in these podcasts are usually C-suite executive, either CIO, CEO, or business leaders. And of course, also private equities, right? Focus around emerging technologies, geopolitics, and impacts on overall technology business. So today's guest is a special friend and an amazing leader, and you'll get to meet him in a few seconds. Our guest today is the author of the book, The Pretender. This is an amazing book. I loved it. A lot of people out there, this has been out for several years. It's doing very well. And you'll get a chance to get to meet the author in a short moment. So one of the things that I really loved about that book, this book is about the author's almost 3 decades of experience working with the FBI as an undercover agent. But what I really liked about the book was there were so many lessons in there that is not only this is entertainment value of learning about the undercover world of FBI agent, but it also that so many lessons that you could apply in a modern business or even personal life or even personal safety, right? So some of the tools and techniques that the author talks about that I think you could use it even for personal safety, especially if you live in a big cities these days, I think it's really useful, but also some of the leadership lessons, right? How we can all apply that. So without further ado, let me introduce my good friend for over 3 decades, my mentor, my best friend, Mark Ruskin. Hello, Mark.
John, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on your podcast, I must say.
Likewise, my friend. Well, first of all, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here today because I know you're a busy man doing a lot of cool things. So, Mark, I'm really psyched. So, for our guest, our viewers rather, so this is the book. I hope you can see it clearly. It's called The Pretender by Mark Ruskin. Amazing book, guys. I really want you to go check this out. A lot of good stories, entertaining, and a lot of lessons that I think we could use in our daily life. In our business life. So Mark, before we dive into the book, I've known you for almost 3 decades. We're close friends. You could have chosen any path. You're one of the few people in the industry that you had many options available, right? You graduated from Vassar. You were a prosecutor for Brooklyn DA's office. Some options were limitless. You could have joined Cravat, Swain and Moore or Debevoise or Plimpton, one of those big law firms.
Well, maybe.
Right? You could be making millions of dollars as a criminal defense attorney. But here you chose to go on the path of becoming an FBI agent. And nonetheless, an undercover FBI agent is probably one of the most dangerous jobs, rewarding, challenging, but also dangerous job out there. So why don't you just kind of share with my viewers of what made you choose that?
Well, perhaps I can start with a little bit more fleshing out my background a little
Absolutely.
further. After graduating college, I worked for Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the senator, or became the senator from New York. I worked on his campaign and was offered a position afterwards down in Washington and followed him down there, where I worked for 2 years. And I had an opportunity to see how government works from the inside at an early age. So very early, I was disabused of any illusions I may have had about the functioning of government. I'm not sure if it was Churchill who said that you don't want to know how sausage is made. It's like you don't want to know how government functions. It's not as clean a business as one would perhaps like. But I learned a lot and then followed that up with law school. And following law school, as you pointed out, I worked as an assistant district attorney in the Brooklyn DA's office in New York, where I developed a real interest in criminal law and criminal procedure and in criminal investigations. And while most most former prosecutors, when they finish their time as an ADA, an assistant district attorney, they tend to go into private practice, as you pointed out, and not necessarily for a white shoe law firm, but for some kind of private law firm. And often, when I would talk to former ADAs, they would regret that they left the excitement of being in the DA's office and how bored they were with their current work. And in my case, I was looking to do something more exciting and not something that not flying a desk, as it were. So I applied to the FBI, and after a kind of a rigorous procedure, a year later, was sworn in as an FBI agent. But I wanted an exciting life where at the same time I would be really making a valuable contribution to society and to protecting my fellow Americans and fellow citizens. So that was essentially how what my thought process was, and I was not disappointed at all with my decision, and I've never regretted it in the least.
Clearly, it shows it in the book. It shows how much fun you had doing the job. Clearly, I mean, well, as dangerous as it was rewarding for you, right?
It was dangerous. I think one of the things I realized writing a book really is an amazing opportunity when you're a memoir, in that it gives you a chance to review your life, basically. So I had a contract with St. Martin's Press. I had a little over a year to write the first draft. So for a year, I was able to spend my time almost full time reviewing my career, reviewing my life, basically. And it was an invaluable experience and really uh, showed me, I was able to see it from a different perspective. While I was living it, I never really thought that what I was doing was particularly dangerous. I was doing undercover work with some very dubious characters, and in retrospect, I realized that it was a lot riskier and more dangerous than I had thought at the time. But at the time, it seemed like I was just enjoying myself, and I looked forward to work throughout nearly 3 decades. I could wake up in the morning and be happy to be working.
Wow, that's amazing. No, you really had a pretty successful long career, so that's truly a blessing. And you're one of the few people you got to do what you genuinely loved, right? So so having said, let's get back to the beginning. What do you
Sure.
say? So let's go to 1985. 1985, you're a brand new agent. You graduated from Quantico, and your first assignment, San Juan, Puerto Rico,
Right, right.
right? So, so two twofold questions. So one is if you could give us an overview of what that assignment was like, and the second was what was your takeaway, given this is your very first assignment.
When I was a new agent, in new agent training at Quantico, my dream was to be assigned to Miami. It was the time of when Miami Vice was a popular TV show, and Crockett and Tubbs were the two undercovers who wore Gucci suits and drove around in Lamborghinis and had this very high-flying lifestyle as a undercover, as a UC. And that was my dream. And I had actually written a memo asking that I be assigned to Miami and emphasizing my mother was Argentine and I speak native Spanish. So I emphasized my ties to the Hispanic community and how I would be a successful agent in Miami. I didn't realize that the memoir I had written had San Juan stamped all over it. I mean, they must have read it and figured this guy is perfect for Puerto Rico. So San Juan, which is ordinarily an assignment which for experienced agents, in part because of the high risk factor, I was landed in San Juan straight out of Quantico, and it was quite an experience. my supervisor, I was assigned to the reactive squad, which was the squad that handled violent crime. So I was working fugitives, extortion, kidnappings, and here I was, a few months earlier, I'd been in the courtroom. Now I've got my bureau car. I've got a dozen cases assigned to me.
So what was that car? Was it a Lamborghini?
Not quite. Being the junior guy on the squad, so a squad had about this squad, the violent crime squad, had about a dozen agents, and since I was the one with the least seniority, I had the privilege of driving the clunker, the worst car that the office had, or that my squad had. So it wasn't quite a Lamborghini, but it was a bureau car, and I had a wonderful supervisor. I had thought that I was going to be, one of my fears in joining the FBI was that it would be too regimented an organization. There would be paramilitary, chain of command, and all this. And that is true to a large extent. However, for the individual agent in the field investigating cases, the supervisor, John Navarrete, who's unfortunately passed away from cancer, he assigned me the car, assigned me a few cases, and told me, I'll see you at file review in a couple of months. If you need any help, call. And there I was on my own. I had all of Puerto Rico to drive around and investigate cases in. And it was the opposite. I mean, it was totally independent. There was no one looking over my shoulder as to what to do. Now, it wasn't all as simple, as one-sided as that. There was a dark side to it as well, which is that active in Puerto Rico in those days was an organization called the Macheteros. The Macheteros was a terrorist organization dedicated to overthrowing the government and installing a Cuban-style socialist, communist type of
It's
government.
a separatist group.
Separatist group.
Okay.
And they, as I found out soon after we arrived, considered the FBI as combatants.
Oh, wow.
Which meant fair game in their war for independence. And you'll see, or your viewers will see when they read the book, that there were plots and attempts to assassinate an FBI agent, and there were only 40 of us for the whole island of Puerto Rico. Must have had a population of over 4 million people, so we were just a very small number of agents, and with these terrorists who were dedicated to killing us. And they did actually kill a member of the task force, and we had information at one point, informant information, that they were targeting an FBI agent for assassination, but we didn't know who it was. So being a target in a terrorist group was not something I had anticipated, and there were actual attempts to surveil myself and other agents who I was friendly with. So, as far as a takeaway, during the time period when we were actually concerned about our own physical safety, and I had one actual confrontation with some members of the group.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So how did they recognize you? How did they know you're an agent?
Well, they used some of the same tools that we used in terms of, their leaders had been trained in Cuba
For counterintelligence.
in how to operate as terrorists. I mean, they were trained. They were not just individuals who acquired some firearms, and they were trained soldiers.
Okay.
And they were trained, in addition to military type of operations, into how to conduct the surveillance and the counter surveillance. So they knew, for example, our office was not a secret location. It was in the federal building in Rey, downtown San Juan. And they would conduct surveillance themselves. So they would, park their cars outside of the federal building and would try and follow agents discreetly without us knowing we were being followed, to find out where we lived.
Oh, wow.
And then they could make their nefarious plans. So So they were developing intelligence to use against us in much the same way that we were developing intelligence to use against them. And I mean, the story, what happened, I lived in a building which was right near the beach, in an area between the Condado and Isla Verde, which, and it was a very nice new building.
By the way, I've been there recently. Yeah,
Yeah,
very nice.
it was beautiful.
Yeah.
We had a security guard in the building, and at the time when we had learned of the plot to kill an FBI agent, the security guard came up to me one evening and he told me, I chat up people. I like to have, friendly relations with everybody, and I become friendly with the security guards at the building. And he told me that in the morning, both in front and in the back of the building, there were front and back entrances. He had observed a car parked with two individuals sitting in the car, and that once there were all the agents who lived in the building. There happened to be 5 FBI agents who lived in this particular building. Once all 5 of us had left, then the car would pull off and disappear, and then it would reappear in the evening. So he was concerned that there was some kind of surveillance going on by somebody, with bad intentions. And so when he told me that, first, of course, I told management in our office, and I told the other agents who lived in the building to be aware that of some elevated risk. And the way the building was set up was there was a back entrance to the parking lot on a side street that had a cul-de-sac. So I had 2 cars. I had my personal car, which I would park in the parking lot of the building. And then I would park the bureau car, the clunker we were just talking about, in the cul-de-sac, and then enter through a gate from the back of the building. And one evening I drove in, it was dark. And as I entered the cul-de-sac, I observed that it was a car parked at the entrance, kind of a beat-up looking car that you would see in the caseríos, the projects there, with 2 men sitting in the car, and the lights out and the engine off.
Oh boy.
So I drove past them, I looked, saw them, and then parked my car near at the end of the cul-de-sac. And then I had kind of a moment of truth. Up to that point, I had been feeling a lot of anxiety about the threat, to the point where I was wondering if I'd made an error in terms of leaving the DA's office to become an FBI agent. Did I have what it takes? I was really beginning to think that I had made a mistake, that this was really going to be too stressful and too dangerous a job. And I was having trouble sleeping. I had loss of appetite. And so that was the state I was in at that time, leading up to this evening. So I had to decide what to do. What's the appropriate thing for me to do now? And what I did is I got out of my car and started walking towards their car. And as I did, I took out my .357 Magnum. It was a stainless steel large frame revolver, something like this big.
Like a mini cannon.
Like a Dirty Harry.
That's right. That's exactly.
Revolver. And I was holding it out to my side, kind of, the way maybe not in the movies, but in real life, that's how I'd be walking with it. I wouldn't be pointing it up, but I was clearly visible. And I started walking slowly towards the car with the 2 individuals in it, and nothing happened, no movement. I get closer and closer and closer, and then when I was maybe 10 feet from the car, all of a sudden the engine kicks into life, and slowly, they put it in reverse and started to back up and make a Y U-turn, and then slowly drive off. Like they were clearly not panicked. They knew what they were doing. But the the end of the story is that they never came back.
Wow.
And the security guard told me that was starting the next day. There was no surveillance, no bad guys parked in front or in back. They had gone, and my anxiety was gone as well. And once I had confronted the threat and reacted in what in retrospect was, I think, the appropriate way, instead of hiding from the threat, I confronted it. And so, for me, the big takeaway from my time in San Juan perhaps would be the transformation from an attorney who sits in an office to an FBI agent.
No, that's amazing. It's scary, but nonetheless, it is amazing because as I see, this is where you're becoming a full-fledged FBI agent. So if it's okay with you, I'd like to fast forward a little bit.
Sure, let's go
So the
ahead.
next thing that really caught my attention was here you are, a former prosecutor, and then you're in San Juan, working to infiltrate or eliminate this separatist group movement in Puerto Rico. And then your next assignment, here you are in stock exchange as a stockbroker. And I'm pretty sure you were never a stockbroker prior to this moment, right?
That's
This
correct.
assignment. And the way I see this, the way I frame this question is like this is Mark Ruskin, the true chameleon. This is where you're becoming a real undercover agent. Not only you're taking on a subject matter assignment, that's something that you have no background in, right? So you're you're like a character actor. You're becoming that character. But not only that you were pretending, although the book title is The Pretender, you were really committed. You were dedicated to the craft. Here you are in the stock exchange. You're studying to get your broker's license, right? Broker dealer license. And I believe it's the commodities trade floor.
Yeah, it was the commodities.
Right. And in 6 months, you pass the exam, get yourself licensed, or you get licensed, right?
That's correct.
And so I'm going to pause here because I don't want to, butcher the story, but this was a fascinating turn of event. And it kind of shows that this becoming of Mark Ruskin, the true undercover agent, right here. Would you say this is a right assessment?
Well, this was my first real undercover operation. In San Juan, after a year and a half in Puerto Rico, I transferred into a group called the Special Operations Group, which was a covert surveillance uh, squad, basically. And I had a fictitious ID and a car registered under a fictitious name, but I wasn't actually interacting with criminals. But it was my introduction to the world of covert activities, and so it was something that appealed to me, something I'd been interested in before I became an agent. And once I had transferred back to New York, I also worked for must have been a year and a half or so in the special operations group in New York, and then volunteered for a long-term undercover operation, which is the one you're referring to, called ComCorp, which
Correct.
was short for commodities corruption. Undercover operations often have a title, and this was the title that the case agents had come up with. And it was similar to a case that had occurred in Chicago a couple of years earlier in the Chicago Commodities Exchange, and this was targeting corruption in New York. And the mission, essentially, there were 6 undercovers, 5 from the FBI and 1 from the Postal Inspector's office. And the mission was essentially to become a broker and develop relationships with crooked brokers who engaged in fraudulent activity in order to develop evidence against them and ultimately arrest them and hopefully put a cease to the corrupt activity that was happening on the exchange. But it involved, this was in those days there was no training in undercover operations. The FBI had no school, no training, so it was all OJT, on the job training. Once I was selected for the case, I basically worked for 6 months developing a false identity before I even went onto the exchange.
So this is all you. This is not nobody providing you support. There's no back office doing the work for you, creating your identity. It's all you. You're engineering your entire persona.
Pretty much in those days. I mean, I did, they did, the Bureau did provide me with a driver's license,
Okay.
a fictitious driver's license. But everything else, my history of residences where I'd lived all my life, verifiable. Uh, where landlords could be interviewed and said, yes, he did live here under the, with knowing the fictitious name, which was, it was Henri Marc Renard was the name I was using. And so all that, the prior residences, prior jobs, bank accounts, checking, with checking and savings accounts, all that I had to create myself. And it was a great learning experience. The whole case was a great learning experience, in part because I perceived it, and I think correctly, as having very low physical risk. I mean, I was investigating an exchange on Wall Street. It was actually in the World Trade Center, the towers, at the time. But in a situation where, if worse came to worse and I was discovered or unmasked, there was very little possibility that any physical harm could result out of it. So it was an opportunity to learn how to be an undercover agent without having to worry about getting, killed in the process if I were to screw up. So it was a great training ground for being a UC, which later on, once I started working with really dangerous characters, I was already used to using a false ID and inventing facts about myself on the spur of the moment. Sometimes it was necessary to think very quickly, but at least I knew how to be a UC with the training I got from ComCorps.
So you think this is what gave you the street cred that ultimately gave you, I guess, being part of Craig Duttler's group, right? C21. This is where you were, I guess, brought in. I mean, you were not part of C21 at that point, right?
Right. I guess, as you've seen from the book, my supervisor and good friend at the time was Craig Dottler,
Correct.
who also sadly passed away from cancer just a few years ago. But in order to get onto the case, I had to be interviewed by him and Mary Jane Boker, who was another supervisor, and the case agents and other people involved in the case. So I had, submitted a request. In those days, there was no email. We didn't have computers. I had seen a memo at our offsite and had submitted my name as a candidate for the case, and then they picked me. And a day later, there's some amusing aspects to it, but I don't want to get too much into the weeds. It's in the book, but how I ended up getting onto the case.
Got it. So, folks, you got to buy the book to really get into the weeds. That's the message, right?
Yeah, either the book or the audio book or the Kindle.
That's right. So, no, excellent, Mark. This is amazing. So here you are. Fast forward. But before I fast forward, how did that turn out? The Operation ComCorps.
There were two. It kind of imploded. It was a two-step implosion. One, I was able to avoid the first aspect. Initially, all 6 undercovers were working in the COMEX, which was one of the 2 exchanges. There was the COMEX and the NYMEX. So New York is the NYMEX.
Correct.
And I didn't enjoy working so much with the other agents and with the subjects that they were involved with. And I had moved over to the NYMEX, where I was going to become a local trader. That's someone who trades for their own account, not someone who works for a big trading house like Solomon Brothers or or what have you.
So were you like in the movie like Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy? Were you on this actual floor
Yes.
screaming out those numbers?
Yeah, that movie was actually very accurate. I think it's the only movie, the first movie certainly, that it was where they allowed filming on the floor of the commodities exchange,
Wow.
and that's what it was like. And so I had moved over to the NYMEX. The other five were still in the COMEX, and one of the five, a wire was discovered on him by the other brokers. So that kind of was to put the kibosh on him and the other, some of the other undercovers, as far as the case was concerned. I was already in the NYMEX at the time, so wasn't associated with that particular incident and was able to continue working as a new broker. The case, to bring it to, a long story to the conclusion, I ended up being recognized by one of the attorneys in the NYMEX on the floor of the exchange, and she basically told her managers that she had seen someone that she knew on the floor and that she had reason to believe I was a federal agent.
What a
And
rat.
yeah, she'd been a former, as I learned later, she'd been a former ADA, a former assistant district attorney, and here she is uh, bringing, ratting out a law enforcement officer doing a federal investigation, conducting a federal
Yeah,
investigation.
she's supposed to be siding with the good guys, not the
Right.
bad guys, right? Yeah.
But I tried to bluff it out. I almost succeeded in bluffing my way through it, but at the end of the day, the case was done, and I was transferred to our satellite office in New Rochelle. It doesn't exist anymore, and that's where one of the supervisors, Craig Dotlow, was based. And he offered me the opportunity to work on another long-term undercover operation, which was called Run DMV, which was a play on the rap group called Run DMC. So this was Run DMV, and involved the investigating the market for fraudulently issued uh, official identification documents for driver's licenses, registration, social security cards, passports. There's a market, as you know, for that kind of document, real ones, not forgeries. It was a big problem because there were terrorists coming into the United States. They'd obtain this kind of ID documents and then disappear into the heartland, like the ones who did the Twin Towers attack for Al Qaeda, and mafiosis with false IDs and fugitives. So we were trying to figure out how these documents were being produced and who was selling them, and we didn't. All we knew was that they were on the street, but we didn't know how they got there. And the purpose of the case was to figure it out, and then for, ultimately for me to develop relationships with the people who were doing this kind of activity. And it was a 2.5 year investigation, which resulted in about 50 people being arrested and prosecuted.
So this was a much broader than just going after some crooks. I think part of this investigation also uncovered some public corruption, if I'm not mistaken. Am I right?
Yeah, it was essentially a public corruption case,
Okay.
although the characters were not the ones you would typically consider in the public corruption case. It wasn't a congressman or a senator
Correct.
and all these white collar people. It was really a street level criminals, many of whom were involved in other types of activity, of dangerous activity. People who would be in the market selling false documents could also be selling weapons or drugs or counterfeit currency. I mean, they were involved in a wide, many of them at least were involved in a wide variety of dangerous illegal activity, which I engaged in with them in order to develop cases as well. So these were, many of them were people who
Okay.
were imposed a significant threat.